Okay, thanks everybody. Welcome to Best Again. This is a crossover show that we're going to do record on both of our, actually all three of our shows. I'm Andy Nichols, the co-host of Two Legs. Joining me today is Kid O'Toole and Dr. Kenneth Womack from Monmouth, also co-host of, actually the host of Everything Fab 4. And today we're going to do a little bit of a dive into the 1980s solo Beatles. And is it really as bad as we think? Or is it really that bad for all solo Beatles? How are you, Ken?
Doing great. Just enjoying this first night of the fest. Can't believe it's almost the later hours of it. It's going by so fast.
Yeah. Ken, how are you?
Doing quite well, Andy.
All righty.
Still fresh off your incredible turn on our record club for Odyssey and Oracle.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Ken does Tuesday Night Record Club with Monmouth. We did Odyssey and Oracle, The Zombies, which was a great record, a deep dive. We talk about the 80s, there's so much attention paid to the 70s music, the solo Beatles, especially when John was alive. But the 80s, there's a lot of activity, posthumously from John, but a lot of activity, and history's kind of not been, too nice to it, we think. What do you think, Kid, overall?
Yeah, I mean, I've with the exception of a few albums, we should say, we'll get into that in a second. But definitely, I've gotten the sense over time that the 80s in general, I think for some music has been kind of dismissed, and people tend to think, oh, that was kind of a low point for the solo career and their solo careers, and that's what we're going to talk about. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. Ken, what say you on 80s solo Beatles?
Well, generally, the 1980s are interesting if we sort of fly up 40,000 feet in terms of history, right? Because there's several inflection points. Obviously, the murder of John Lennon casts a long shadow. Certainly in Great Britain, I was just there on a Beatles tour, and it was interesting the effect that had on heritage tourism in the United Kingdom actually increased dramatically. After many years, many fallow years, it increased dramatically. In terms of the music scene, there's that highly competitive moment in the late 1970s and early 1980s when all of the dinosaurs, as we now call them, were really in deep conflict, right? Putting out new records, new music, still putting out compelling music. And this is that sort of world where the solo Beatles found themselves. A world that, frankly, they'd invented as the Beatles, right? They'd invented this place for singer-songwriters to share their work and imagine their artistic ambitions on this massive stage. And now, in a way, they're victims of it in the 1980s, and certainly with a new music coming along, which vis-a-vis MTV, etc. So it's an interesting inflection point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that, they found particularly, George, Paul, they found themselves at kind of a crossroads. Where were they going to fit in to this new pop landscape?
Pop landscape, videos, something McCartney took, a great interest in with being all over the map, really with talking more the video agent, and the collaborations, right, with Michael Jackson and Stevie Wonder, which kind of people poo-poo. But I'm sorry, they're good. They're good collaborations. I know you feel the same way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, what people don't remember, some people don't remember, who like to dismiss Ebony and Ivory, or even The Girl Was Mine, or, those were big hits. They were Ebony and Ivory was number one for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, something like that. They were big hits in their day.
Yeah, I think Paul was faced with a decision. Obviously, after John is gone, he's not going to go out and tour. So what's he going to do? He finds something, let me get commercial, let me work with people who are pretty big and stay in that wheelhouse. And you get a lot of exposure, and he did. I think you can't fault him for wanting to do that and taking that route. And it bothers me that people like to just crap on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people have asked me who were, shall we say, a bit younger, younger than Gen X, how was The Girl Was Mine such a big hit? you know, it was.
I've asked you that. But
Yeah, I know you did.
I don't understand it, but I mean, I know that we're in the same room as Alan Kozin, and this is a good thing. And I bring this up because, you know, some of the questions that we're asking about the 1980s, I'm sure he and Adrian will be covering, and that is the artistic choices that McCartney's making, and part of them that I have issue with is the way in which he comes out with a triumph, obviously with Tug of War, and it is a triumph that has diminishing returns because, you know, there's a kind of regurgitation of music that's taking place with Pipes of Peace and then with Give My Regards, where he isn't creating necessarily new music, right? Now, one thing we learned in Alan's fine new book is that, you know, Paul always had a lot of material sort of in his critical vein that would come out at different moments. You know, it may say Wings on it, but, you know, it was a solo track, right? And I feel like in his case, since he's one of our four choices here for this period, he's starting to accrue diminishing returns on this practice in the 1980s, which leads us to press to play rather, and, you know, and then eventually, you know, Flowers on Earth.
Which it bookends the decade in a nice way for Paul. And obviously Paul is the easiest to talk about, right? Because he was the most prolific in the 1980s. But if you look at Tug of War and ending Flowers in the Dirt, to your point, there's one middle period there.
There is, and he loses his way for a while, and especially when he's working with there's some moments with Phil Ramone.
Yeah.
And does he work with David Foster?
He does, in '84.
Sort of.
Well, David Foster produced, you know, We Got Married, which was on Flowers in the Dirt.
Right. So it's just an interesting period. Now, I think we could argue that he's the most well-equipped for the 1980s, with a movement toward music television, MTV, and VH1. He is photogenic.
Right.
You know, he likes to ham it up in videos, so it's kind of a safe space for him, and he does better than the others, you know, arguably with maybe the exception of Got My Mind Set on You and the Harrison moment, which kind of happens in the 90s a little bit.
Right.
Right. But Paul's well equipped for that shift that is happening. Janine, my wife, likes to joke about, you know, the difference in being a rock star in 1979 versus 1984, right? You know, in 1979, you could be Nick Gilder, have a hot child in the city, and look like hell. You know, really, and make it work. You know, because nobody's really seeing you. And of course, then we have Christopher Cross, right? Which is such a classic example, who isn't photogenic, and it works really well for him for a while. Yeah, and then it doesn't. So there are a lot of shifts taking place, again, in this world that they invented, right? I mean, they're making music videos. They're making them way ahead of their time.
I mean, he pulls in a contemporary producer like Hugh Padgett for Press to Play, and it's done. You know, he gets Phil Collins, you know, on a track, you know, to work on it, and it's just done. It just does not work. You know, these are the current hip people. It was not translating to success for him at that time.
Well, again, I think, you know, as I said, Paul was trying to find his way in this new, you know, landscape. Now, as I said, Tug of War was the exception that he really, you know, had this incredible, well, of course, starting the decade with McCartney 2,
Right.
Which other than Coming Up, and, you know, which was a major hit, but the rest of that album was, you know, with the exception of maybe Waterfalls, was not what I'd say was commercial.
No.
You know.
Successful, but not.
You know, so then Tug of War, you know, great success, and then Pipes of Peace. Now,
you know, Kate, to interrupt though, in our conversation that we had with Chris Thomas, a lot of these elements are already in place for Paul, right? I mean, Chris was very revelatory when he was talking about the making of Back to the Egg, and the way that Paul kept trying to submarine his own project, right? And there was the gambit he plays with David Bowie. right, at the Replica Studios, where he brings Bowie in, and Bowie's like, well, I don't like this stuff. I like the album anyway, the first. I'm paraphrasing, but it was a fascinating discussion because it was that kind of second guessing that you see McCartney doing. Now, when you look at the 80s as a whole, it's a successful period for it, right? I mean, you know, like you said, there were these superstar collaborations. You know, he's still relevant in '89, and he goes on a massively successful world tour that essentially goes for 4 years if you know, through the world tour. So, in a lot of ways, he's still playing the form of the 80s. He's must have been, and again, we'll learn more in the forthcoming books from Alan and Adrian, but in some ways, the more challenging subjects are the other three ex-Beatles. You know, obviously, John Lennon is in a fractured space, be dead. You know,
But there was a real revival of Lennon material in the 80s.
Sure, and a lot of this was done with the Lost Lennon tapes.
Yes. Menlo Avenue, Live in New York City, you know, and all culminating in the Imagine documentary film. So a lot of really, and No Honey too, don't forget, in '84. So there's a lot of, you know, he's very still prevalent and still very fresh in people's minds.
And for a very competitive period, I mean, nobody told me it's legitimate. It's
Yes. I remember that quite well. I mean, it got a lot of airplay, radio airplay, the video to it got a lot of airplay as well. And then, yeah, sometime in New York City when that came out, or not, I'm sorry, Live in New York City, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that got a lot of publicity.
Yeah, sometime in New York City was...
Sorry, folks. That's a lot.
What a record.
Yes, indeed. But yeah, that got a lot of publicity at the time. And then, yes, the Lost Lennon tapes. I mean,
Big.
That
Westwood one, big.
Which, by the way, they could make serious money, and I'm sure something must be in the works, reviving that, or at least remastering and making those mixes available.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Instead of us all listening to them on YouTube and bootleg.
Yeah, exactly.
Fact. 100%.
Yeah.
So it was obviously John wasn't here, but it was still a really good decade for him to be obviously celebrated. It was still so new because he was gone, so we had all this extra material. So he was still very, very present in that decade.
And before we leave him and his former writing partner, he is casting a shadow that Paul is now wrestling with, or still jousting with. There's a, you know, pick your metaphor and your gerund. He's doing it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll never forget, there was an interview in the now defunct Musician magazine, which I really miss. I love that magazine. And it was after Press came out and didn't do well. And I think it was an interview to promote All the Best, the greatest hits compilation that came out. And it was, and I think the headline of this interview was called "Paul Gets Angry," and it was Paul really fighting back, you know, against, and it was like John Lennon's memory in a way. And he really let loose in this interview. Alan, I don't know if you've seen this one. And it, you know, he was really fighting against his memory because it was still kind of a time when John, you know, I mean, it wasn't that long after he passed, about 7 years, and, you know, he was still kind of kind of sainted, and it was...
Paul used the word sainted.
Yes,
yeah,
right. And so he was still, you know, he was sort of saying, you know, he wasn't the Beatles, I was too, and, you know, that kind of period.
There's another interview around the same time. Now I know this was going to do with Chris Saladick, who we had on our show, the Q interview in '86, and he was really assertive, to Kate's point, getting to what, you know, basically being very frank and very honest about Lennon and Ono, to which you would never hear him talk like that this time, you know, today. But that period, way much more. You make a good point. Around that time, Kate, he was, you know, 5, 6 years on, he was starting to feel like, okay, he wasn't a saint. Let me tell you how it really was. Interesting. How about the other two Beatles?
Well, of course, George, early in the decade, was going through an interesting time because, you know, he had Somewhere in England. And yes, it spawned the hit all those years ago, you know, which did very well. But as we all know, he had a very tough time with that album, to say the least.
And it got worse.
Yeah.
With Don Trumbo.
Yeah, exactly. You know, he was somewhere in England. I mean, the record company didn't like it. He had to go back and record more material for it, and gave the record company the middle finger with the first track Blood from a Clone. You know, to show exactly what he thought of the record company. And he had such a negative experience with that. He said, "Okay, I'll give you one more album, and then I'm done," which was Don Trumbo.
Right.
Which was rejected, right?
No.
Somewhere in England was.
Somewhere in the original version of somebody.
Don Trumbo wasn't rejected.
No.
Don't believe so.
No.
It just was released without any fanfare at all. Just.
You wouldn't do any publicity. And now, interesting though, because when Don Trumbo first came out, I mean, you know, it was just really trashed by press, didn't do well. But I think in recent years, it has undergone kind of a critical reassessment.
Well, yeah, you've got Circles on there, the old Beatle leftover track that was done with the White Album sessions. And I think That's the Way It Goes is also on there. That being included in the concert where George brought that album into a lot of the consciousness of people, I think, too, which is lended itself to that.
I would take us again, and as we did with Paul, I would go back to 1979, right? And a lot of what happens in the 80s for McCartney is set up by what he saw as the poor sales of Back to the Egg. We talked about, you know, vis-a-vis Chris Thomas, etc. You know, George is coming off the George Harrison album with Blow Away, which felt like he was commercial again. And I don't know, if John Lennon isn't murdered and he doesn't have all those years ago, I don't know that somewhere in England has any level of success at all.
The 80s was a really weird decade for George. You know, first couple albums, then he's really quiet. He gets a lot of films, handmade films, Time Bandits. There's a lot of work in film, and then I don't know if his business dealings went south in the 90s or the 80s when he got ripped off by his manager. That could have been really
So ripping off must have begun.
Yeah.
You don't realize it yet is the question.
Right. So it has this kind of, in the 80s, like nothing virtually from George at all, and then out of thin air, we get Cloud Nine.
Yeah, well, what really was the turnaround for him was when George was invited to do that Carl Perkins special. That made him fall in love with music again. And, you know, when you watch that special, which, you know, it's just wonderful to see now, although it's kind of bittersweet because, you know, so many are gone, you know, that played in that special. But you can see it in his face, you know, how much he loved playing. He was playing with his hero, for God's sake, you know, and, you know, you could just see the look on his face, how thrilled he was. And it was after that he thought, okay, I think I'm ready to record again. And of course, with his good friend Jeff Lynne, that led us to Cloud Nine.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really, and while all this is going on, still too, the Beatles are still kind of fighting, there's lawsuits going on still, so there's all that still going on during this period.
But they're getting a boom in 1987 with the very carefully engineered release of the CDs, which by the way, had been turned into, it was an event cultural moment because they waited, of course, until most of the other dinosaurs have done their thing, and then they released it methodically. We all remember the fanfare associated with that. So, you know, that was really the beginning of the kind of event culture that takes us through right today, quite frankly, in the way Apple operates.
Yeah. Before we get to Ringo, let's just touch upon a point which was also in the 80s, which was kind of a really kind of sad moment, which was their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in 1988, I want to say it was, with Paul's non-appearance. What do you guys feel? You should have went, or do you think it was right to stay away?
I think it should have gone. I mean, I understand that, you know, what was going on at the time, the legal issues. Excuse me, I don't think Paul and Yoko were on wonderful terms at the time. But, I mean, this was the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think they could have put their differences aside for one night. And, you know, it was kind of a sad.
It is.
It was a sad evening, I think. And I think that, yeah, I think just for one night, they could have, you know, they could have put their differences aside. I don't know. What do you think, Dan?
Well, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a vexed institution, right? I mean, it's like all halls of fame. We question choices, the acts who are selected, the ones who are not. I mean, we could probably poll our audience right now. I'm wondering why Franklin's still in the thing. You know, and while I love, we talked about this the other day, I love the Zombies, but it's like they get in and...
Right, but...
Yeah, so
certainly more.
you know, now their timing was everything in this century. I agree that it was an unfortunate moment, and it felt like a tantrum. But you know, again, this is not the first time, right? You know, I think about Paul staying in the bath when they were meeting with Brian Epstein. You know, these are
but then you've got
people play the form.
You've got these periods of warmth where you hear that George apparently invited Paul to come on when he was to be in the video for when he was fat. He wasn't available back during because you see, you know, somebody did the pepper suit walk or the walrus suit walk by. So, you know, there's moments of iciness and tension, but you know, ultimately, you know, it got us through, as you pointed out, to get us to the anthology and all everything that we got in the 90s and after that. So, I mean, but George still ends the decade awesomely with the Traveling Wilburys. I mean, talk about going on a high note.
Yeah, one of the best supergroups ever, to say the least. Absolutely classic. And, you know, it was really interesting. I remember when George made that comeback with Cloud 9, and not only, of course, were diehard fans thrilled, but, you know, I was in high school at the time when Cloud 9 came out, and when Got My Mind Set On You came out, and as you mentioned that really clever video, the two of them, yeah, that's right. I didn't see the pinball video for years.
Yes.
I mean,
There was always the one in the library with the heads and stuff.
that's the only thing. Yeah, so I didn't even know about that other video for years. But anyway, it was so great to see my friends who, you know, many of my friends at the time were not Beatle fans, didn't even really know George, and they were just kind of like, who's this guy? You know, and I was telling you, I said, well, I told you they were good, I told you George was good. So it really introduced him to a whole new generation, you know.
It was so wonderful, that whole period was such a wonderful late triumph for him. You know, it also gives us the wonderful trivia question, who was the last Beatle with the #1 song?
Yeah.
So far,
It's still
George.
Yeah. It's still George, but to ride them, as Ken said, to ride that wave of momentum, starting with Cloud 9, continuing with the Wilburys project, really, I remember that was really a big thing in like 89, 90s, everywhere. Especially that first album. The second one's okay, but the first one was like fantastic. It was handled with care, everything about that record, and the group and the spirit which that came from is who George was. And to be having such difficulties, especially at the beginning of the decade, to get that shit, and to go out, really. And then he rides that into the early 90s with some touring, which we think we had to do financially. We toured Japan in 92, but George is really busy there from like late 80s into the early 90s. I mean, very, very active.
So he may have, he certainly, we know, needed the money, given challenges in his own life, particularly for a very expensive piece of property that he owned, still owns.
Did you guys go there?
No, we not in the front part. But we didn't even stream by the gates or anything, but that probably would have been a good idea. Anyway, you know, we know he had some financial challenges, but you know, a lot of that was Clapton, who had his band together and said, wouldn't it be fun, George, if we did this? And you know, they didn't really enjoy it as much as they both hoped. Well, it's obviously because George never tours again.
No. But yeah, it was, you know, and then that just leaves Ringo for the 80s. So, not a good decade for him.
No.
Not at all. As, you know, the White Cool commercials, come on.
And I'll say again, the 70s ended badly for him, you know, in terms of music, right? And losing contracts, etc. It's a rough period. Now, one of the bright lights for him, though, is the founding of the All-Star Band.
At the end of the decade.
Yeah.
Right, at the end of the decade, it's been a wonderful, one of the great bright lights of the solo Beatles is the all-star band.
Yeah.
And obviously something that has brought him and us a lot of joy.
Yeah, that was a
But in terms of original music, you know,
Two albums, and one was even released in America.
Yeah,
Oh, wait.
Now, Stop and Smell the Roses, while, it didn't do well, there are a couple of highlights there. There's Rack My Brain. That's a fun song, which, of course, George wrote for.
Yeah.
Private Property is also a kind of a fun song, and that's Paul. Who wrote that for him. I also kind of like the song Dead Giveaway from that. That's not a bad song either, but...
I always had a soft spot for Attention, that's just Paul wrote.
Oh yeah, that's right, Attention, So there are, a few decent kinds, but yeah, Rack My Brain's my favorite.
But I think history's given, that album is actually pretty solid.
Yeah, I mean, that's got, I'm not saying it's my all-time favorite album, but it's gotten a little more respect in recent years. But
Caveman, right?
and then Caveman, where you met Barbara Bach. So, not a great film, but
yeah, I would say it's not a great film. I think that's a safe thing to say. So there's obviously the commercial and critical spheres, right? Ringo's having trouble in both areas.
And
Pretty significantly though, he's having difficulty.
I think, honestly, of all three Beatles, John's passing affected him the hardest. And I think that's why he struggled through that decade.
Well, the whole decade and the story of the Beatles is affected by that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Oh, how could it not be?
We can imagine many different ways that the 1980s progress.
I mean, Wings was probably going to tour America with a and Lawrence Stewart told us that on the show. He's like, we had number one in America, we were going to come here and tour. And,
we all know what happened.
right,
Yeah.
but,
But in a way, it is amazing how Ringo came back. I mean, because it could have gone a very different way, and so good on Ringo that he stuck it through and recovered, and boy did he recover with, as you said, the All-Star band that's still going strong.
and to get through such a tumultuous decade where there was so much up and down, critically,
And his own personal problems.
yes,
I mean,
personally, big time.
he beat a lot of demons by the end of that decade.
Yeah.
A ton. And for them to all come out of that decade and having some success all of the world tour, George with the Wilburys, Ringo with the All-Stars, and then to the end, then be able to do the anthology, that's how it's supposed to be. It's as good as it could have been, given the decade that they all three of them went through.
Exactly. So,
Well, what's beautiful about it again is that they invented this music, right? I do hope they find some joy and joy and satisfaction over the fact that in the 1960s, very early on, they're creating a blueprint that's going to change an entire industry in terms of popular music in almost every way, including the self-expression that comes from songwriting and performance of those songs. We're going to have a singer-songwriter period. We're going to have amazing highs in the 70s. We're going to have MTV. We're going to have the music of the 80s and beyond, the resurgence of rock, grunge in the 90s. So many of these moments have their legs, sometimes in a tiny way, and other times in very large fashion in the story of the Beatles. And even though they may not have been as commercially effective in 1995 as solo artists, they still birthed this. And I hope that they find joy in that, or satisfaction. This is an enormous thing that they loosed upon the world.
And still
Still happen. Yeah.
You're still feeling it.
You can find it in Billie Eilish. You can find it in virtually every genre where people write songs and express themselves.
Yeah. Now you guys were in the 80s, like contemporary at the time. We've been now 40 years ago. But growing up then, were they considered old then? Like they're in their 40s then.
Yes.
They're considered old, right? But we don't look at it through that lens now.
Well, our understanding of age is not the same.
yeah.
Right? just isn't. You know, we think about growing up and growing older in very different ways now. You know, people expect to have longer careers and longer periods of relevance. I mean, Townsend wasn't joking when he wrote, "I hope I die before I get old," right? The idea that he might still be doing something when he was 40 was ridiculous. So, you know, a lot of invention is happening in that industry in real time in the 1980s. I mean, I laugh when I watch those early 1980s videos of the Who, right? Doing You Better You Bet. Another tricky day, yes, which probably didn't need to be committed to video, but you know.
Oh, it's still good though.
Oh, fine. But my point is, here they are, they're on their second drummer, right? And they're still churning it out, and it's almost against everything that we expected. Didn't Pete Townsend famously write an essay on when Mick Jagger turned, was it 40 or 50 in Rolling Stone? 4 or 5. Yeah, and it was, I thought it was quite shrewd of Pete. Because he was recognizing how we were in the process of thinking differently about age. I mean, the idea that Paul would be making new albums, right, in this century. Not just one, right, but several. Yeah, it was ridiculous. You know, you don't do that.
No.
You know, so we're still trying to understand popular music and how significant it is to folks. My colleague Joe Rapola, who you guys know, who does music industry at the university, thinks a lot and thinks deeply about these issues. And he's endlessly fascinated by the fact that, you know, it's such an impactful industry, and we all love and adore the songs that are important to us as much as anything or anyone we know, right? It's very powerful. So, and yet this industry, you know, is dwarfed by the detergent industry. Or, I mean, it probably should be. We should have clean clothes and smell not rank out of the world, right? Or that, you know, it's dwarfed by the car industry or this industry, and yet it has such power to it, you know, because it's so important to us, even though often its progenitors are screwing it up.
Yes.
I don't mean the musicians as much as the money men who run it. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And the Beatles birthed that too.
They reap the rewards of it too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you guys have anything you want to talk about?
Tony.
I want to mention these two final John Lennon albums, Double Fantasy, Milk and Honey.
Right.
I think some of his best stuff is on these albums, especially Borrowed Time, I'm Stepping Out.
Oh, yeah.
For a guy who wrote so many dark, sad songs, those two are his most heartbreaking songs, I think.
Yeah, Kid had one about Borrowed Time.
And I wanted to ask you also, when I was 23, I'd go to the library and look at the music section, and they had every McCartney album from the 80s, except Wall Street. And I became obsessed with Flower in the Dirt. I'm a huge fan of that one. And I want to ask, I was shocked when I found out it wasn't a huge seller at #1 top 10. Why do you think that was?
Oh, was it the first?
Is that Broad Street?
You know what I mean, Flowers in the Dirt?
No, Flowers in the
Oh, Flowers in the Dirt.
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's interesting to bring that up because he was asking why was Flowers in the Dirt not a big hit. Because we do tend to call it, some people call it like, oh, that was his comeback album. But when you know, look at the sales figures, it really wasn't a big hit. I mean, you know, it was more, yeah.
UK #1, I know.
Yeah, it was UK #1, but yeah, not here. And it was really the tour that was the big comeback in terms of money. I mean,
My Great Face was barely top 10.
yeah, I mean, it was really, yeah, My Great Face, you know, we tend to think of it as
Not
well.
a top 40 song.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, it's fascinating to think that.
Yeah, but the life of that record, you feel the Beatles, you feel the Beatles sound in that record.
I mean, it's all, the hindsight is 2020, you know, it's been out for so long now, you can look back and you can say it wasn't appreciated at the time, but people appreciate it now. And I think it's a wonderful album, I love it, it's one of my favorites, but, you know, the critics can still be very harsh when it comes to the ex-Beatles too.
Oh,
There's
sure.
almost this desire to not like anything they do. So that can have a lot of impact on the perception as well. I mean, the figures don't lie, but the impact on the sales can be, it can be impacted by what people say about it, and so, there's a lot of factors in there.
But it was critically loved. I mean, everyone said Paul and Elvis Costello, isn't this great?
Yeah.
And all the press was like, this is the new band on the run, going right past Tug of War. So
I don't know. I think part of it in terms of sales may have been just, it probably didn't sound, quote, commercial in terms of what was on the radio. I think that was because, as you said, My Brave Face, and it did sound Beatles.
Yeah.
And you would think that's a good thing. But if you wanted to get on top 40 radio,
it was an success.
It may not be
Timing, though, I would go back to timing again. So Lawrence Strieber is exactly right. If they tour in 1980, they're going to see the result of that. Just as if we'd been fortunate and Mr. Lennon had not been murdered, right? Even though Devil's Fantasy was selling slowly, a spring tour on the heels of a controversial Rolling Stone cover photo would have shot that thing to the top of the charts by itself. That industry that exists in 1979, 1980 is not the one that Paul releases Flowers of the Dirt.
Exactly.
Right? And that's a different period where touring doesn't necessarily equal the power of returning an album to the top of the charts.
Right.
It's a different landscape, right? It's a remarkably different landscape.
more so
Now, and so you have to, when you look at these different periods in the history of recorded music, the context is so very important, right? What do you have to do to get a #1 album today? How many units do you have to sell?
Not much.
Not as many, right? It's
Not much.
a completely different period. You can't really compare some of these periods one to another. You have to think about the larger forces that exist. And Flowers in the Dirt is released into this very kind of awkward space, right? It's highly competitive, and obviously it has a very successful world tour.
Yeah, I think it suffers a little bit because it has a couple different producers on it.
And it sounds like it, and my respected SRR colleague, who loves the record, I love parts of the record.
Yeah.
Parts of it to me sound like the worst successes. Some of them sound like the worst successes of the 1980s. There's a plastic quality to some of the songs, and yet there are others, distractions on that, right?
Yeah.
I love that song. I love My Brave Face. These are wonderful tunes that are very well crafted.
Motor of Love.
Yeah, I don't want to hear that ever.
I kind of like that song.
I don't like, there's another one that just drives me nuts on that record.
Don't Be Careless Love.
I don't like that. But it can be like that with a lot of records, but as far as creating a cohesive statement.
Correct.
He's not setting himself up well as he did in 1982 after working with George Martin for a couple of years to put something out like that.
Yeah, which is, I think that's one, I mean, it's a great album, and the great tracks are phenomenal on Flowers of the Dirt, like all time.
There are a lot of albums that have one or two, not just
Oh,
artists,
sure.
every artist I can think of has a couple of clunkers on the back of this album.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I think that had been a
Costello,
Costello.
this album though should have no clunkers.
well,
But that's right. Careers are littered with filler.
Yeah, if it had been a true McCartney Costello album co-written together with the extra tracks they wrote together, that would be a cohesive. That's a cohesive statement.
Yeah, not to put pressure on Alan, but that's the one I want to hear, right? Is if he had approached it as, let's make a record together.
Yeah, not a couple songs.
Yeah, not a few tracks, not working with multiple producers.
Right.
I mean, one of my favorite records is certainly later than this, but the Baccarat Costello.
Oh, great.
It's that album. I love it. Painted from memory. I mean, I would like to hear Paul. I would like to have heard Paul put something cohesive forward with Elvis
Yeah.
Because it did give him a kind of edge that he still didn't.
He did, he really did it, and he said that as much still. He felt that creative energy that he had somewhat related to John. It was like the first time he felt on some kind of level like that again, in terms of songwriting, sitting down with somebody. You know? So the 80s was obviously up and down. I still think it's overall okay. You know, that's just
That was a ringing endorsement.
more than okay.
I'm not sure it was that good a decade anyway.
No, but there's really, the highs are high and the lows are really low.
I'm the Gen Xer here. I like the 80s. I grew up with 80s music. I mean, Tug of War was a great, great album. Cloud Nine. And I liked, I will say, was Paul's some of his other work uneven? Yes. I mean, Press to Play. However, I liked some of the tracks on Press to Play. Yeah. And I think Only Love Remains. I think that's one of his best ballads.
We all have our favorites. I love Telephone Typewriter.
Yeah. Oh, that's
I mean, I hear it and I realize all the problems with it, but I'll play it again anyway. You know.
But it's a cohesive album.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, there are some problems.
Sorry, Ken Michaels, if you're watching.
Yes, sorry, Ken.
Yeah, Ken, I'm sorry. Not everything is great.
Yeah.
But you keep the fire burning. Keep the fire burning.
And
any other thoughts from you?
Yes.
That's a great question about, yes, sir.
David.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, it ties into what we're just talking about. You know, people have a tendency these days to talk about the harmony sound of Wings, the blend between Linda and Denny, of course. But when you're talking about 80s McCartney, at least to my ears, those harmonies on those records are a lot more lush to me. I hear them more prominently, but that's not Paul, Linda, and Denny anymore. That's Paul, Linda, and Eric Stewart.
Which is the 10cc sound.
Right. I mean, Eric Stewart is all over Tug of War. He's all over Pipes of Peace. Those were huge records. He wrote a ton of songs on Press to Play. And yet, it's very rare to hear people talk about Eric Stewart. And I wonder if any of you have an opinion as to why that might be the case. Is it as simple as most people, other than Ken and me, not liking Press to Play very much?
Well, that's a big collaborator for Paul in the 80s, as you mentioned. He's on all that stuff, and he was really involved in Press to Play before things kind of went south between those two. But really involved a lot in the 80s with Eric Stewart, and that sound it's all over all those records. I enjoyed it for what it is, except the earlier stuff, obviously Tug of War, and even some Pipes of Peace. Yes, I do like that album quite a lot.
Yeah, well, and Pipes of Peace will always be sentimental for me. That's the first Paul album I ever bought. Eric Stewart was on So Bad. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, So Bad. I love
Both versions.
Yep. I love the harmonies on that. I mean, I thought they did some good things together.
I think Eric thought he was going to like the next
Wayne.
and certainly was looking that way, and then things went south there.
Next
Press to
is
Play.
I'm not going to say anything. I'm just let that sit there.
Yeah, that's what he thought, But they did do some, I got some good tracks together, and I'm a So Bad defender.
It's a wonderful song.
Yeah,
I love
thank
it.
you.
No, it's just, again, that kind of movement amongst so many different collaborators, both as producers and as songwriting partners, musicians. I don't think that was helpful for him. I believe that it created more convolution than cohesion.
You thought he just should have done it himself?
No, when you look at the best moments from any of his different periods, the kind of sustained work often would produce results.
Right.
And I don't know that he was getting there.
But what about Return to Pepperland?
I was going to mention that, man.
Yeah, what about it? I mean, that may have been the biggest reach of them all, right? Because it's desperate.
And is he replying to George in some thinly veiled way because of the whole pepper pastiche thing?
You know, it's almost, that just felt like a desperate moment to me, which is probably why.
Well, the song and the album, I mean, there's a full album. There,
Right.
Indian and Squid.
Most of those songs are great.
Yeah, I agree.
You got Same Love, Indiana.
Don't forget Beautiful Night came out of those sessions too,
Yeah.
which is a win.
Potential hit singles.
And a lot of the basic stuff for Flowers and Dirt came out of this.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, definitely came out of the last attempt there in that record. But thankfully it didn't come out.
So to take it the other way, first off, Kit forced me to say I love Old Wave. It's not a great album, but it's a good album. So I have to say that. And you kind of skip right past it.
So, you know, part of the issue here is the issue of being prolific, right? You know, part of the challenge of being prolific is you want to put it all out there because you're trying to get to the next thing. And obviously Paul is prolific in everything. I mean, during this period, what we had, one or two collections of his art are released in book form.
Yeah.
You know, so he's working in lots of different veins all the time, probably right now. And so, you know, you want that work to be out there. You're not as selective, right? It's like any genre, or genres in this case.
Well, again, you know, I think coming back to the, you know, trying to find your place in the current, you know, pop landscape, I think George really did nail it with Cloud 9 because, and with Jeff Lynne.
After years of toil.
Yeah, after years of toil, yeah, well, yeah. Because I thought it really captured, I mean, you had his signature sound, you had the slide guitar, you had the, you know, like with something like when he was back, you know, the humor, you had the, you know, in some of the songs, a little bit of the spiritual, a little bit, I mean, toned down from some of what he did in the 70s, but you had a bit of it there. But it had a modern sound to it, you know. I mean, it really sounded contemporary. And I think he really was, you know, that record really nailed it, you know, and made him, it's not, I mean, it wasn't, you know, him trying to rap or do something, you know.
Mike Hayes, the greatest soul album, Beatle album of the 80s?
Yeah, possibly, you know, and or Tug of War. Yeah, I mean, Tug of War is the other. And maybe you could say a bit of that with Paul too, that it, you know, it really captured his sound, but it didn't sound dated. You know, and that's a hard balance to strike.
Anybody else?
Well, Cloud 9 is my favorite George Young, besides the best one.
Yeah.
I'll say that. And also, I'm curious, what was the reaction like to Men Love Avenue, the John album of outtakes?
I was too young.
Well, for
Well,
me,
Yeah, it felt like it had no fanfare.
No.
And actually, I remember buying Press to Play. I'm not Press to Play, Pipes of Peace. You know, there was such a buildup for Tug of War. And then one day I was at Target, and it was Pipes of Peace, and I almost felt like I didn't have the usual kind of advanced excitement about it. I remember just saying, well, hell, I'm going to buy this, so I bought it, you know, and I remember throwing it in the back of my car in my trunk, which is probably stupid in Texas, because I'm lucky it didn't, you know, immediately warp, or melt, right, but at some moment, there wasn't the kind of event experience that occurred with the solo records, for whatever reason. And that was, to me, just felt like the beginning. I remember going to see Give My Regards to Broad Street, the film, at the famed Greens Point Mall. Yeah. And I think the only people in there were myself, my brother, and Ed. And Ed left early because he couldn't stand it. And my brother, I think, fell asleep. He was just happy because I was allowed to drive, you know, so we drove out there. But you started to not have the kind of event moments. And Men Love Avenue didn't feel like an event to me when it came out. Whereas other posthumous Lennon records did have the appropriate fanfare and the reaction in the press and among, you know, people who bought records.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Milk and Honey was definitely had the most fanfare.
Yeah, and what happened, it just felt like.
Sloppy and unfocused.
It just showed up. One more question, Joe.
Yeah, agreed on all your points about Cloud9, love that album. And speaking of George, I guess in closing, hypothetical, how would the Traveling Wilburys have been affected if Elton John and Gary Moore had joined like they were initially supposed to?
Whoa.
It's hard to say.
So it's Elton John and who?
Gary Moore, Elton, and had to go to rehab, so that's why he couldn't make it, and Gary was going in more blues direction.
Oh, okay. So Elton John and Gary Moore.
I honestly don't know if it would have lasted.
Who would they have replaced?
Right.
I'm forgetting who was in their places, but I know they were the two original, like they were approached by George for the project. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that would have worked, especially with Elton, somebody who's huge, as huge as he was.
Although this is Elton in the late 80s.
Right.
You know, I mean, he's still big, but.
Right, but that would have been very interesting to see what Elton would have brought to that.
Yeah.
That could have changed the sound pretty significantly
Yeah.
because the rest of them kind of knew each other.
Yes.
Had there's a little country rock in
Yeah.
there, a little rockabilly. You know, that would have taken it in a kind of different, maybe a very interesting direction.
Yeah, that would have been cool to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll piano in there.
Would Roy have been allowed to stay?
I don't know.
I would think
That would have been a
so.
very interesting suit for him to be in.
Yeah.
Roy was the inspiration. I should got to stay.
Yeah. What about Eddie? Eddie was kind of came on at the end, right?
Right. Yeah. And Jeff Lynne was there by default as the producer. So.
Right.
All right.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
I don't know if I didn't hear you say it or not, but McCartney's last top 10 hit, Spies Like Us.
Yeah.
That's right. Number 7.
Yeah.
His last top 10.
If you don't know.
He's got to be better than that, right? I mean,
Yeah, and in America, here.
Mhm.
So, all right. Well, I think that is going to wrap it up.
Yeah.
So, we're going to Ken was this house. Thanks everybody for coming out this second crossover. We're talking two legs. Thank you, and we'll see you the rest of the weekend. Thanks, everybody.